Hello, beautiful family. How are you all doing? Thank you for the love and the support. So, my beautiful people, today I have a quick one to share with you. One that's the normally say shall never and see. This is Progress the Analyst, and here I try to keep you updated. I bring out the latest happening. So, today I want to take you direct to Abazonia, Cameroon, Finland, and Norway. A lot was said. Please do well to watch it to the end and get all the latest information and the updates direct from the right source. Thank you, and I'll be right back.
On the Amazonian people. Today, let's have an insightful and educational interaction with Dr. Michael Rubin. Doctor, thanks for joining us, sir.
Thank you for having me, Lucas. It's a pleasure to be here and with the Amazonian audience.
Well, we're so glad to have you. You have quite an extensive background. Let me read a little bit of your background. You are a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a director of policy analysis at the Middle East Forum. You are a former Pentagon official. You've lived in post-revolution Iran, Yemen, and also Iraq. You have also spent time with the Taliban before 9/11. Very interesting. For more than a decade, you've taught classes at the C for the Horn of about the Horn of Africa, the Middle East conflict, culture, terrorism, to deployed U.S. Navy and Marine units. Dr. Rubin is the author and co-author and co-editor of several books exploring diplomacy, Iranian history, Arab culture, Kurdish studies, and Shiite politics. Holy smokes. You've been in the most contentious parts of the globe. You've lived in places most people are scared to go there except your special forces. How have you been able to do all of this?
Well, thank you very much, Lucas. As you know, there's no better way to learn about a region than to be there. And I should say what's actually not on my biography, but explains a great deal of my interest in Amazonia, is I used to work extensively in Black churches in Philadelphia, where I grew up, and I was a Congressional Black Caucus Foundation Fellow in the U.S. Congress before my career pulled me a little bit more into the Middle East. But I often, when I go to these locations, will end up interacting not only with government officials, but also with students from a bottom-up approach so that I can understand the ground truth. And my goal, and I'm not in government right now, I'm in a private institute, is to help advise the US government on how to correct US policy, especially among the voiceless. And I should say that the institute where I work, American Enterprise Institute, is a nonprofit. I do not get paid for any of my work with regard to Cameroon or Amazonia. I'm not a lobbyist. My salary is there to just call things as I see it. But I want to make that clear for the audience that no one is paying me or telling me what to say. I'm doing this because this is what myself as an individual conclude. And this is what I advise the US government when I have the opportunity to.
First of all, we want to thank you. You've traveled, you've had a very long flight. You just came back from India. That was last night. And for you, a few hours later, you're conducting this interview. This means a lot to us. We're very grateful. People are very grateful. You have something very important and very special that will be worthy for our people to pay very close attention. You've written an article that is alarming in the first place, but it's also very exposing. You wrote an article about the Rwandan genocide, the causes of it, the triggers of it, but you also made a correlation, you drew a parallel between that genocide and the conflict in Amazonia. Here are some of the things you said in your article before we get started. You said the anti-Tutsi genocide in Rwanda was not spontaneous. You quoted Mr. Robert Muse, a respectful Washington lawyer who made an extensive research travel. Uh, you said the French trained and encouraged some of the worst elements known to advance the plan for the Hutus to slaughter Tutsi. French soldiers even mounted checkpoints. The French, after the genocide have started, even spun a cynical narrative blaming the Tutsis for provoking the genocide. This is like saying the Jews provoke the Holocaust. Help us give us a background of that research, the article, what you found, the empirical evidence, and what first of all made you to write this article in the first place.
Well, thank you very much. I'm a historian by training, and so I spend a lot of time in the archives and among other historians. And I also, while I've only been to Cameroon once, just in the airport in Douala, so I've never really been in the country. I do spend a lot of time in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Central African Republic, Rwanda, and the Horn of Africa, as well as places like Mali and Burkina Faso. So when I'm coming to this region, although I hope one day to come to a free Amazonia and a free Cameroon once Paul Biya dies, and that can't happen soon enough. At 92 years old, he shouldn't be a dictator anymore. Cameroonians, not just Amazonia, Cameroonians deserve better as well. The point of this is that when it comes to the anti-Tutsi genocide in Rwanda, it's now been more than 30 years. And so many of the documents surrounding it in Paris, in the Quai d'Orsay archives, the archives of the French Foreign Ministry, have been declassified. And what we see is a concern in those documents that Paul Kagame and the Rwandan Patriotic Front were Anglophones, and they wanted to make Rwanda Anglophone. And the French, for the very simple reason of their twisted perception of national honor, that everyone should speak French, decided to help the Hutu extremists. And they did this with the full knowledge. Now, not all Hutus participated in the genocide. There are many moderate Hutus, and they were killed too by the extremists. But for those of you who have seen the images of the anti-Tutsi genocide, you know about the machete-yielding militants at the checkpoints. Oftentimes, those people were trained by the French, or they even had French special forces with them in the run-up and during the initial days of the genocide. This is now not only undeniable, but last year or 2 years ago when this was exposed, Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, flew to Kigali to meet President Paul Kagame, and he apologized for the French role. Now, I would say that apology is insincere if we see much the same behavior from France today. And you know what? It's not just in Rwanda where people are tired of French cynicism, and it's not just in Amazonia and Cameroon, where the 1972 abrogation of federalism was nothing short of illegal. We see people, Africans, reacting to the cynicism of the French in Mali, in Burkina Faso. The French need to come to terms with their own history, and they need to come to terms with justice and the illegality of some of the dictators like Paul Biya, whom they're relying upon. The French have relied on Paul Biya for decades, but again, he's 92 years old. He's going to die. And not only people in Amazonia, but also in people in Cameroon want nothing other than the dictator to be gone, and they associate the French with that dictatorship.
So tell us, what role does the French policy to make sure Rwanda becomes francophonized, influenced, drove, triggered, sponsored the the genocide in Rwanda.
Look, I mean,
Because
the archival documents show that was the whole reason for the genocide. The French wanted to rely on the Hutus because of Belgian colonialism,
yes,
were more French speaking, and many of the Tutsis were not. That was enough. That language discrimination, that ethnic discrimination, was enough to drive French policy. At the same time, the French like a compliant dictator. Why? Because the French like to loot resources. We saw this in the Central African Republic. Rwanda didn't have as many resources, but Amazonia does. Cameroon does. And that's why the French now rely on Paul Biya. And that's why, the same reasons as Rwanda, that's why they really are encouraging the perpetration of genocide in Amazonia. Now, the difference between Rwanda and Cameroon is in Amazonia, the problem is the abrogation of federalism in 1972. The problem is that in the original referendum, people didn't have an option to become independent. That the people in Amazonia don't want to take over all of Cameroon. So I see a resolution, if the French would correct their policy, as being even easier in the future than in Rwanda, simply because in this area, the history devolves. The people of Amazonia don't want to take over much of Cameroon. They only want their own homeland.
and you said here clearly that the prime motivator for the French president at the time, Francois Mitterrand, was antagonism to the Tutsi for seeking to be Anglophones. The French policymakers, the policymaker class, sought to preserve Francophone even at the cost of genocide. Sir, is this the same policy Mr. Biya and the French are using in their war against the Amazonian people in order to turn Amazonia into a French type of a French type of a conquered territory, or is it something different? What is the underlying motivator of Biya's war on the Amazonian people?
The answer to that is yes. The French are doing this because of a twisted pride in Francophonie, but they're also doing this because they see themselves still as colonial masters of Africa. Countries like Cameroon may have become independent, but in the French mind, they're still second-class countries. France doesn't treat them as equals. And so from the French perspective, it's not simply a matter of controlling Paul Biya, but the problem is also that they don't want any country that is primarily English speaking, they see as a threat to their influence. And they don't understand that this sort of 19th century mentality, this sort of mercantile driven colonial policy, is the reason why across the Sahel people are turning to Russia or to other countries, and why the French are hemorrhaging influence. You know, this past August, I traveled to North Kivu in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where M23 is now fighting the Congolese government. And in the portions of North Kivu I was arriving at, some people spoke French, many people spoke English as well, and it is one of the main reasons why the French are supporting the Congolese dictator, Felix Tshisekedi, even though he's been a complete failure and has the aspiration to become like Robert Mugabe or Paul Biya. The fact of the matter is the French may say one thing about human rights when they're sitting in Europe. The Norwegians, too, who have arrested your president. But they say another thing, and there's an inherent racism when they look at Africa and how their policy is driven in Africa.
Help us understand, besides the language issue, which France wants to make sure it secures in Amazonia. Help us also understand what is behind France's primary interest in supporting Paul Biya and the Cameroon government, besides their benefits in Amazonia, which is where 65% of, I know you already know this, which is where 65% of the GDP is coming from, which is where most of the natural resources, the oil is coming from. Help us to understand what else is driving this French hatred or interest.
You know, it's hard to explain the French, period. But a lot of it, I mean, when we look at what drives French policy, number one is pride. Number two is resources. When we look at the Central African Republic, the French tolerated a brutal dictator who declared himself emperor for years, because we now know from, again, archival documents and from police investigations, the French leadership was receiving diamonds, basically was receiving not just the benefit to France, but in a corrupt way to their own bank accounts. I suspect something similar is occurring with Paul Biya. The problem is that when you support a dictator, ultimately that dictator collapses. And to be perfectly fair, this is one of my criticisms at times of American policy as well. Too often in the United States, and it doesn't matter whether you're Democrat or Republican, we will support individuals over systems. But an individual can be gone tomorrow. Inherently, what you need to do is build up a system that can control your government. This is what Lucas Cho has been doing, or had been doing, before the Norwegians arrested him. Now, the point of this is that the French right now are probably even more scared and more worried because the person whom they placed all their bets on, President Biya, is, again, he just had his birthday. He's in his 90s. He's not going to be there forever. And they're probably very, very scared that when he goes, that there's going to be chaos. So this is the reason why in 2016, when the president was already in his 80s, they cracked down so hard on the peaceful protests because they're afraid of civil society. But you can only kick the can down the road for so long before the road ends. That's what we're seeing right now in Cameroon and Amazonia.
What's the influence of France's need for uranium fueling Mr. Biya's action in Amazonia?
Well, look, to some extent, yes. But most of the French uranium still comes from Niger. That said, the belief that there is, that the uranium exists and that in mineable qualities is also driving the French. Also, look, the 21st century economy is based on rare earths and various minerals. The former oil minister of Saudi Arabia, Zaki Yamani, famously said, the Stone Age didn't end for a lack of stones. And what he was implying was the oil age isn't going to end for a lack of oil. We're already moving on to a new age where so many of these minerals become important. And so when we look at the Democratic Republic of Congo with $24 trillion worth of resources, when we look at the Central African Republic, there's a reason for the struggle right now between the French and the Russians there. And Cameroon, of course, is right, if you will, in the same region. And therefore, I mean, there's a belief that Cameroon could be wealthy in the way that Kuwait or Qatar are wealthy in the Persian Gulf, only instead of having the gas and the oil drive the economy like in the 20th century in the Middle East, some of the mineral resources are going to drive the economy in the 21st century. And so one of the reasons why Cameroon doesn't want to have Amazonia be free, I'm not even just talking about independence, I'm talking about what the agreement originally was with regard to the federalism, is because of pure and utter greed. They want a greater share of this money. They are corrupt in Yaoundé, in Cameroon, and the French want their piece of the pie. And if I may, Lucas, this is the same thing that's going on with regard to Nigeria and Biafra. I mean, the two countries, Amazonia and Biafra, have a lot in common. Of course, in Nigeria, language isn't the issue so much as religion, but really the resources are one of the most important reasons driving this conflict.
So what could be Norway's interest then in all of this? What is Norway's interest? To arrest Dr. Cho? How is Dr. Cho a stumbling block to what you have said in terms of all of this economic interest, to protect this economic interest? How is Dr. Cho a stumbling block to that? How is Amazonian quest for freedom a stumbling block to that? As you've quoted, as you wrote in your interview, will they do this?
Okay. Yeah, Lucas, let me broaden out just for a second, and not just talk about Norway, but talk about Scandinavia. Talk about Finland, Sweden, and Norway. We often hear about the Scandinavians praising themselves about their respect for human rights, their respect for democracy, and all of that. But when you actually look at their record, it's rather poor, and if I may, it's also rather racist. So, for example, as you said in your introduction, I'm much more of a Middle East specialist, and I spend a lot of my time with the Kurds, not just the Kurds in Iraq, but also in Turkey and in Syria. Now, when the United States and NATO wanted Sweden and Finland to join NATO, the way NATO works is that it's a consensus organization. When you take a new member, everyone has to agree. You can't just have a vote. And so Turkey was able to blackmail the military alliance by saying, we're going to veto Sweden joining unless Sweden betrays the Kurdish dissidents who lived in Sweden. Stockholm has one of the largest populations of Kurdish dissidents and also Turkish dissidents, all the journalists that the police state in Turkey tried to arrest. And you know what? Sweden caved in and even sent some of the Kurdish leaders they arrested back to Turkey, where they would be tortured and perhaps they've even been killed. So Sweden, of course, is cynical. And now that brings us to Finland.
What they should prepare themselves for, what they should get ready for, what they should anticipate, or what specific steps and action they can take between now and October 7.
Look, and the people of Amazonia are doing what they need to do. They tried to resist peacefully, and we saw what happened after the teachers' protests. So they need to do what they need to do. That said, when it comes to securing the local communities, that's going to be up to the Amazonians, because they're in Douala, in Yaoundé, in other cities in Cameroon, there's going to be chaos as people try to fill the void and a civil war erupts. This is why it's so essential that the Norwegians be on the right side rather than the wrong side of history.
That's your advice for the Amazonian people. What's your advice for the Camerooners? What should Cameroon do? What should the young people in Cameroon do? What should women do? What should civil society movement do? What should political opposition party do in Cameroon in anticipation of the chaos?
Well, first of all, I mean, perhaps Cameroon's greatest export has always been its people, simply because Paul Biya is like President Isaias in Eritrea. I mean, just an incompetent brute who cares nothing about his people and only about himself, who treats his country as a country of slaves. So it's going to be very, very difficult for them. But the diaspora community, especially in France, should be protesting every day in front of Quai d'Orsay in order to make clear that Paul Biya isn't their leader, isn't their local leader, isn't their legitimate leader. In Cameroon itself, there is no magic formula because, look, I can sit here outside of Washington, D.C. and pretend that I have the answers, but I'm not facing Paul Biya's secret police. I'm not facing a prison term or torture in Douala. I mean, the fact of the matter is, I can say what I want, and Paul Biya can't do a damn thing to me. So I have it easy. But if I were living in Cameroon, it's a very different situation. So they also need to ensure and be lobbying right now in across Europe, in the United States, wherever they are, for the aid and the assistance to come in and for the legitimacy to be denied for any new dictator. Cameroon is one of the most brutal dictatorships in Africa and one of the most brutal dictatorships on earth. And the African people deserve much better. I mean, there's no reason. Look, African solutions for African problems. So why shouldn't Cameroon be like Botswana or Namibia or South Africa? Why shouldn't it be a country that thrives? And the fact of the matter is, the Cameroonian people have the human capital to do this. It's just going to take the removal of the dictator Paul Biya, and that can't come soon enough.
Welcome back, our fellow viewers.
With you, I'm glad we've worked out some of our technical difficulties.
You're very passionate about what you were saying. Let's get back to it. We're getting to the end of this program. Let's get back to it. Did Norway anticipated the backlash after arresting Dr. Cho? Did they anticipate the backlash? There was an expectation that by arresting the Amazonian leader, Cameroon will succeed to decapitate the leadership, both in the diaspora and on the ground. 5 months later, the forces on the ground are much more stronger. Our leadership is much more focused, and we have intensified our diplomatic outreach and engagement. Did they anticipate all of this?
No, it's clear they did not. The Norwegians were operating from a position of ignorance. They probably, I mean, look, the Norwegians only have contacts with the Cameroonian government. The Cameroonians lodged a complaint, and without knowing anything about the legitimacy of the complaint, the Norwegians acted. But the fact of the matter is, what's going on in Amazonia is an attempted genocide. The Amazonians have no place to, nothing, I mean, they can't do anything but to fight if they're going to remain alive, if they're going to remain free. They are on the correct side of international law. And so the Norwegians now are learning a lesson. What we need to do, what Amazonia needs to do, and what Amazonians need to do is not just condemn Norway for its imprisonment and persecution of Dr. Cho. What they need to do is also give Norway an off-ramp so that the Norwegians will release him in a way that helps them save face. And then maybe, as the Norwegians learn more about the true situation.
So my beautiful family, that brings us to the end of this update. Do well to like the video, share and subscribe. I still remain your one and only Progress the analyst. I keep updating you all the latest happening. Thank you and bye for now.